This is the Bizgnus Podcast, one-on-one conversations with experts in business and personal development.
Acre upon acre of asphalt parking lots, mile upon mile of unshaded roads, dense apartment complexes, and neighborhoods with few trees and few parks. They're all taking a toll on the poor. As climate change accelerates, low-income areas in the Southwest are now 4 degrees to 7 degrees hotter on average than wealthy neighborhoods in the same metro regions. Those are some of the findings from a new study by University of California, Davis researchers. The study's lead author, doctoral student John Dialesandro, and his professor, Stephen Wheeler, both with the UC Davis Department of Human Ecology, are the guests on this Bizgnus podcast. Well, as anybody knows, if you spent even a minute in the Central Valley in the midst of summer, you appreciate the phrase, well, it's hot, but we bake. We don't swelter. But baking is not funny, especially when you look at it as you both have and your other colleagues in examining how hot it is based on whether you're wealthy or whether you're poor. Jake, would you start us off by giving us an overview of what your study found?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thanks for having us on. We really appreciate it. Our study really uncovered that in the Southwestern United States, of the 20 largest metropolitan areas, excluding San Francisco, so I want to caveat that we did not do the North Bay area, Oakland or San Francisco, just because it's less susceptible to urban heat and extreme heat based on its location and maritime influence. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have heat, but we didn't do the Bay Area. But in the 20 other large metropolitan areas, we found that basically, if you're in the lowest 10% of income, your neighborhood is going to be almost 7 or could be up to 8 degrees warmer than your counterparts, which would be the wealthier neighborhoods. Interestingly enough, we found that this range was actually even more in California if you subsetted the data and just looked at the metro areas in California compared to the rest of the Southwest. In particular, the Coachella Valley metro area, which it would include like La Quinta and Palm Springs, these poor and Latinx neighborhoods were actually upwards of 7 or 8 degrees warmer than the wealthiest neighborhoods. And then the Inland Empire, which would be Riverside or San Bernardino, was also 6 or 7 degrees warmer in a poor neighborhood versus a wealthy neighborhood, which can make a significant difference.
So you're talking when the guy on TV, the meteorologist, says it's 110, in some areas it could be 117, maybe worse inside.
Correct. Yeah, no, absolutely. If you take, let's take, for example, if you live in Riverside and you live in a well-to-do neighborhood, you look at the weather forecast, it says it's going to be 110 degrees, and you're like, okay, that's a nuisance, but I'm just going to turn up my AC and pay a couple extra dollars in electricity. You go 2 miles away and you live in an area that, unfortunately, maybe are living paycheck to paycheck. You see 110 degrees, and turning the AC on isn't an option for you. And not only that, but your neighborhood's not 110 degrees. Like you put it, your neighborhood's most likely 115, 116, 117 degrees.
Is that because of what? Because the sun is the sun is the sun.
Yeah, no, it's obviously the heat isn't targeting or seeking out like lower income or Latino populations to impact them disproportionately. It's actually goes back to environmental factors, and there's quite a lot of layers to this, but basically wealthier neighborhoods have more tree canopy, more green space. They have less impervious surface. They have more energy efficient architecture. And then if you go into poor neighborhoods, there's a lack of tree canopy. There's a lack of green vegetation, which provides cooling through shading and evaporation. And then this goes back to redlining practices that happened in the 20th century. Neighborhoods that were historically redlined have been found to be vulnerable not only to heat, but other environmental hazards, which would include, poor air quality, toxic waste, and so on.
So is the solution for the homeowner to put a maple tree in the front yard, or maybe there aren't any front yards to put any maple trees in?
Well, like you said, there in a lot of instances there aren't a front yard to put a tree in, and even if you do have that front yard, water is a costly thing. In a perfect world, California would have unlimited water, and we would just, basically plant as many trees as possible. Los Angeles has a million tree project, but if we had enough water, it would be like a 20 million tree project. And in a Mediterranean climate where, we can go years where like LA averages 14 inches of rain a year. The cutoff to be classified as a desert is only 10 inches of rain. And for most of the year, LA doesn't get any rain. All that rainfall falls in the winter time. So it's a Mediterranean climate. It's a dry land climate, and we just don't have enough water to plant these trees. Now there is a way to get around this in some ways, plant drought resistant trees, but that also is costly.
So is the answer for the government to do something, or is this something that would allow private entrepreneurs to get involved?
I think this is something that would allow in both scenarios, people to get involved, governments and private companies and stuff like that, because the more needs to be studied, but you need to efficiently plant and use the resources that you have. You can't just dump all your resources into one area. It needs to be smartly configured in a way that's cohesive for not only the neighborhood, but also efficient and affordable for the resources that are available. So it needs to be like smart planning that would involve things like light colored roofs, which doesn't cost any water. High albedo surfaces. So instead of having a black asphalt tar parking lot, you have like maybe concrete, which has a higher albedo. And by albedo, I mean high levels of reflectivity, which means that it doesn't emit as much heat. It reflects the heat back without warming the local environment. And it basically boils down to education, knowing what is going to be the best mitigating scenario or the best mitigating practice, and then implementing them, I should say.
What got you interested in this to begin with? What was the triggering event, if any?
Well, I myself grew up in a poor area that experienced different environmental hazards, such as like a food desert. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and that's not necessarily an area that's susceptible to urban heat like these southwestern cities are. And in some ways, they're even embracing the urban heat island to offload energy in the winter time. So they're trying to actually enhance the urban heat island, so the winter energy costs are not as high. But I was interested in it. I've lived in the Southwest in California for the last 7 years, and I studied remote sensing, and I worked at the USDA Climate Hub as an intern at New Mexico State, and we studied how climate change impacted agriculture and how the changing thermal envelope, or for lack of a better term, global warming, was impacting local agriculture. And then I, being also interested in the social side of geography, began looking at how it impacts like the urban environment.
As you were compiling the research, what surprised you? I said, geez, I didn't know that.
I was surprised that the gradient between the wealthy and the poor was so much steeper in California than it was in Arizona, Colorado, or Texas, or New Mexico, or Las Vegas. I was actually expecting the opposite. I was expecting it to be more narrow. I thought there'd be less inequity, so to speak, in California. But it was amazing to see that in California itself, if you compare any California city like Bakersfield to Albuquerque, New Mexico, the gradient between the rich and poor and the gradient between the white neighborhood and Latino neighborhoods was actually far steeper. So it was a lot warmer in these neighborhoods.
Why is that, do you think?
Well, I would like to give what I think it is, but I know Dr. Wheeler has a lot of good thoughts on this as well, and I'll hand it off to him. But there's a lot of things that go into what makes a neighborhood have like a certain amount of tree canopy. If I could use, for example, like Bakersfield or Fresno, a lot of the wealthier neighborhoods are more adjacent to the agriculture fields, and not so landlocked with all this impervious surface. Agriculture fields act like almost not natural, but a green space air conditioner, because there's a lot of evaporation from, the irrigation. There's a lot of shading. There's less upwelling heat from less impervious surface. And then if you were to look at other neighborhoods like or other metro areas, like take San Jose, for example, wealthier neighborhoods are often in the foothills adjacent to green spaces like regional parks, whereas the poorer neighborhoods are more landlocked in these concrete jungles. Dr. Wheeler, I know you've also have a lot to say about that.
Okay, I think one other factor is that water in California has been cheap or free historically. We have had huge federal and state water projects that deliver water to households. And historically in Sacramento, for example, the households didn't even have water meters. You could just use as much water as you wanted. So hence there's more vegetation. It's also a slightly wetter climate, which makes vegetation a little bit easier than, say, Nevada or New Mexico or Arizona. And there's probably a few other factors. Cities like Las Vegas, for example, are very, very recent and don't have some of the older garden suburbs that California cities do. So there's several different things going on.
As you analyzed your results, did you have a moment to say, I wonder where this is going to be in 10 years? What is this going to mean for society in the U.S.?
You know, it's interesting that you bring that up. Oh, would you like to go, Dr. Wheeler, or would you like me to answer?
Go for it.
Okay, it's interesting that you bring that up because there's been a lot of really good data projecting how warming is gonna accelerate in California by mid-century. So, for example, if you can mention that 110-degree day that you mentioned when you were watching TV, and your weather meteorologist is telling you it's gonna be 110, it's going to be now 115, even in the wealthy neighborhoods in 2050. So that's a little further than 10 years from now, but that's the direction, unfortunately, that we're heading. And it doesn't look like, even with all the great efforts that the state of California and the Southwestern United States has done, it's not going to something that we're going to be able to stop. So I actually think the problem, unfortunately, without intervention as far as like local mitigation measurements, and this could be everything from access to cooling centers, more widespread access to air conditioning, or cheaper electricity. So I think the problem's only going to grow unless we take the steps now. When you talk about a flood or you talk about a forest fire, it gets a lot of attention because it impacts everyone, and it's almost devastating. But with heat is the number one weather-related death in the United States, which outpaces tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, and forest fires. But unfortunately, it's disproportionately affecting certain groups. Whereas, like, if you're in a wealthy neighborhood, it's just a nuisance. You just turn your AC on, you pay a couple extra dollars, and it's fine. But it could be life-changing for someone who doesn't have the money to invest in upping their electric bill by $100 in the summer. And that's why I think it gets less attention. And that's why when you say, what is it going to be like in 10 years? I think without an intervention, it's going to be even worse, and there'll be more heat-related deaths. There'll be more.
And folks who are customers of some of the utilities in the state, who are already seeing extremely high rates compared to national averages, they're going to have to mortgage the kids to pay the electric bill.
Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, that's unfortunately true. It's the electricity thing is going to be a large component of it, and it's something that needs to be affordable for everybody. Especially when it comes to like the health ramifications if you don't have it. And you said it perfectly. Like, we have such high electric bills here in the state of California. I think a watt of electricity, like compared to New Mexico and California, is like on the excess of 3 or 4 times as much.
Energy efficiency is part of the planning for climate that will reduce costs for people. My own home, for example, at this point is plus energy, which means we produce more electricity on an annual basis than we use for the house and the car. So we pay very, very little. And any house in California or the whole Southwest could be plus energy. It's not all that hard to do. We do need government, the public sector, to help incentivize and speed that transition, but it is something that has benefits for everyone in the long run.
Well, there's a good positive thought. But before we conclude, what would either of you like to add that we haven't talked about?
The last year or so, we have been dealing with COVID-19 as a society, and we have had to adapt to pretty different things, and we have had to develop vaccines, which hopefully will get rid of the problem. The climate crisis is a long-term version of COVID-19. It is going to be the rest of the century. We are going to have to be figuring out how do we adapt to increased heat as well as many other challenges, and how do we get to a carbon neutral society. And so these are things that require big and systematic thought. They do require a very active public sector role to coordinate things and to incentivize changes. They require private sector to work together with the public sector and civil society to do that. And there will be lots of business opportunities involved and lots of jobs. And they will require all of us to educate ourselves about these issues and do our part.
Jake, your turn.
Yeah, I think echoing everything that Dr. Wheeler said, and then also I want to add that, like, we're so thankful for the opportunity to speak with you, because I think the awareness needs to be enhanced. Like, people need to be more aware of the problem, like for people who don't have the ill effects of the heat. And also, more collaboration between researchers, because there's just so much to research. Like, our study really just scratched the surface. There's a lot of health indicators that could be added to this, like asthma rates and diabetes and hypertension and even arthritis. Like, how are the people who suffer from these disproportionately impacted by it? So I just think more needs to be done. And once the word is out there and more minds are working together, we can really start to solve this problem. But like Dr. Wheeler said, it's a slow burn of an issue. It's a pandemic that's unfortunately only going to get worse no matter what. There's nothing we can do. We have to put every effort we can in, but in this 2050, 2060 century, it's going to be warmer than it is now. Or decade, I should say. In 2050, it's going to be warmer than it is right now. And we just have to do what we can so that trend at some point can turn around.
You've been watching the Bizgnus Podcast. We welcome your input. Send your email to editor@biznews.com. Thanks for watching.